Lately, I've been looking for even more excuses for my wife and daughters and I to spend quality time together. And I think one way to do that is with a game table. The great thing about a game table is that you can eat dinner together and then remove the top panels and spend even more time together playing games. If you want detailed step-by-step videos on how to build this along with the plans, head to the link below and check it out. I start by milling up the lumber. These are 8/4 walnut, and I'm cutting them a little longer than their final length because I need them just to be manageable to work with. We start out on the joiner to get one flat face. And then I flip that face up against the fence so I can get a flat square edge. And then it's over to the planer. I'm planing these down to 1.5 inches thick. And we also want to get that other face nice and flat and parallel. And then last, we head over to the table saw to cut that final edge, and now we've got a piece that's nice and square on all 4 sides. I want the final measurement of these legs to be 3 inches by 3 inches, so I'm ripping the boards down to a little bit over 3 inches to give us some room to work with. And then I pair the pieces up to get the desired look, thinking about sapwood and heartwood. And I'm marking each face that I want to taper. We need to taper 2 inside faces for each leg. And once everything looks the way we want it to look, I use plenty of glue and plenty of clamps to get these really tight. We're trying to hide the seams the best we can and make 2 pieces look like 1 leg. Once the legs dry, they almost certainly won't be flush, so I take them back over to the joiner to get a flat face. And then I flip it over and run it through the planer to get that face flat and parallel to the other one. Now is the time to cut these down to final length because the next step relies on those dimensions. I'm using a jig that I built on this channel. If you want to go search for that video, there's also a free plan if you want to build it yourself. But I'm starting the taper 7 inches from the top of the leg, and by the time we get down to the bottom, that face will be about half the thickness that it was. My saw blade wouldn't raise high enough to account for the jig and the leg, so I had to flip it over and make a second cut. And right on cue, I accidentally cut into a face that I wasn't supposed to, and I wasn't about to build another leg. It's just too time consuming, so I decided to repair it with a scrap piece of wood. Most mistakes in woodworking can be repaired, and if you do them right, you can make it almost look like nothing ever happened. Once I put stain on this, you'll hardly even be able to see it, even if you're looking for it. I take my time with the aprons and pick out the sections of the lumber that I want, because I really want straight grain wrapped all the way around the table. I'm using mortise and tenon joinery to assemble this table, and I'm taking careful measurements and marking them with a combination square, a marking knife, and a wheel gauge. The wheel marking gauge is one of those tools that I just can't live without. It lets me make consistent, quick marks on multiple pieces, and I know that they're all going to be the same. I cut the tenons over on the table saw with a dado stack, and then they need just a little bit of cleanup with a chisel and a shoulder plane. I see a lot of woodworkers that like to cut mortises first and then the tenons. For whatever reason, I've always just liked cutting the tenons first. I lay the mortises out with a wheel gauge, and then I like to hold the tenons up there just to make sure that I'm in the right ballpark. I set the legs up in the position that I want each of them and then mark them so I don't forget, and then take them over to the drill press to hog out most of the mortise with a Forstner bit. There's quite a bit of chisel work to be done after you get done with the drill press, and then I continue to work on them until each tenon fits the way I want it to. The table bottom is going to be held in with a dado, so I cut that about 1 inch from the bottom on the inside of each apron. With the aprons and the legs clamped together, I measure and cut out the table bottom. And then measure and cut out each corner with a jigsaw to fit around the legs. And then I do a test fit to make sure that the table bottom is the right size. Now I move on to cutting the dados for the accessory trays into the aprons and then also the support pieces. We're doing this over on the table saw, and I've clamped each apron and support that go together so that they can be cut exactly the same. With the aprons and supports clamped into place on the table bottom, I use a chisel to clean up the fit and make sure they're flush. And then everything gets a good sanding to prepare for stain and finish. I tested several different stains and landed on this gel stain from Minwax, and it's called Kona. I really like the way that it brings the sapwood and the heartwood together and makes them look like a slight color variation rather than such a light dark contrast. The table bottom gets several coats of water-based polyurethane, and the rest of the pieces get oil-based polyurethane. I'm sanding in between coats, wiping it down with a microfiber cloth before I apply the next coat. I did something with this build that I've never done before, and that was to apply a stain and apply finish before I assembled the project. I ended up just doing this on the base, and on one hand I like the idea, but on the other hand I had to make quite a few repairs. I used blue tape and CA glue to glue these blocks on so that I could clamp onto the blocks and not directly onto the legs. The problem was that even though I waited a few days for this to dry, the polyurethane I used takes 30 days to fully cure, so once I pulled the tape off, there was problems with the finish and even with the stain underneath. I started by separately gluing together the front apron with 2 legs and then the back apron with 2 legs. Once those were dry, I added the table bottom and the end aprons. The spacers get glued directly to the apron that they're matched up with. And then I use scrap wood to try to keep from scratching the finished surfaces. The armrest rail goes all the way around the table, and it's a feature of the table, so I made sure to pick some of the best 8/4 lumber that I could find. The armrest assembly is joined together with dowels, and then the entire assembly gets glued to the top of the aprons and spacers. It was a lot easier to apply stain and finish to the armrest since I attached it before doing so. Now it lays flat, so this made it a lot easier to stain and a lot easier to apply finish, as opposed to the legs, which stand vertically. Would have been a little more difficult to put all of that together and then try to stain and finish the legs. The core of the top panels is 3/4 inch plywood framed with solid walnut. I had to take the walnut to the planer and get it to the same thickness as the plywood, and then miter the corners so that it perfectly framed the plywood with no gaps. Probably the most important part of this veneer process was to get the core of the panels completely, perfectly flat. Every bit of unevenness showed up in my final veneered panel. I made my own press out of hardboard and fiberboard, and then I took some calls from a previous project and cut just the ends on the joiner. This is a technique that makes sure there's plenty of clamping pressure in the middle of the press where the clamps can't reach. In order for all the panels to come together in the same position and also to make them waterproof, I cut mortises into all the inside edges of the panels. And then I cut some tenons on the table saw that would fit inside those mortises and made sure that for every seam that came together there was a mortise and a tenon. Part of what makes these seams waterproof is the foam tape added to the top of each tenon. I also installed rare earth magnets and made sure that they were opposite for each seam so that they came together and didn't repel. To keep the top panels from sliding around when they're sitting on the tabletop, I glued some blocks to the underside of each end. These also make it easy to quickly get the panels in position. There's a hard finish on these top panels and on the armrest, but to keep them from scratching, I added some felt to the bottom side of the top panels where they come in contact with the table. The last thing for the base was to install these little wooden squares in the corners to cover up the gaps left by the table bottom. And then I moved on to making the accessory trays. These are made out of the same walnut. You can make these for all kinds of uses. I made cup holders, an accessory tray, and a book holder. I cut down a metal piano hinge for the book holder. For the accessory tray, I just cut down little strips of walnut and glued them in a box to hold pieces. A better way of doing this, if you have a CNC, would be to use that to scoop out a little tray. The cup holder tray was probably the easiest. I just cut out a circle with the jigsaw and then used some plastic cup holder inserts. And the last little touch on these accessory trays was to add 2 strips of foam tape so that when they're inserted into the accessory slots, there's a friction fit, but it doesn't scratch the table. The felt insert is probably my favorite part of this table. It's made out of plywood, some EVA foam, and then pull table felt. This is a great surface to play cards on, and we really find ourselves using this surface for every game we play. And lastly, I attached some nylon straps to the underside of the felt insert and cover the heads of the screws with EVA foam to keep them from scratching the table. If you want to build this project, head to the link below to get access to the plans and all of the step-by-step videos showing you exactly how to build this for yourself. Otherwise, head over to one of these videos next, and I'll see you over there.